Good morning. Yeah, as Russell alluded to, as it's normally in open source, there are a lot of different hats. I'm the community manager. I also chair the Xen Project Advisory Board. I'll talk a little bit about that later because that may have an impact on you and how the projects run. And I also work for Citrix, who pays my paycheck in the open source programs office. And then I do stuff for other projects as well, such as CentOS and a few others. So, my talk isn't going to be technical. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit. I wanted to give you a brief overview of what the Xen project is and what it does, how it works in principle. I'll give you an update over the last 12 months, how well did we do in the last 12 months, and then a few practical tips of how to work with the community. So, what is the Xen project, right? When most people, think about the Xen project, I think they just think about the Xen hypervisor. But actually, in reality, it's a lot more than that. It started out as the hypervisor, and then it expanded and is still expanding into a few new and interesting areas. And we'll be looking at that and see what impact it has and has had on the community overall. So we have this idea of, or this concept of sub-projects within a Xen project. And what I'm doing here is, this graph here on the right is showing you the sort of mailing list traffic, the conversations which happen on the hypervisor developer list. I originally wanted to kind of put it together for all the sub-projects, but it was too hard. I didn't have enough time to do that, so we'll just use the developer stats as a background. So we started off with the hypervisor sub-project or team, in 2004, and of course that's still around, and it will always be around because that's the core of the project. Then there's actually a team within the Xen project which looks at PVOps. PVOps is a set of components in the Linux kernel which enable Xen. We've run this until recently, are still technically running it as a sub-project within the Xen project, but actually that's just standard Linux kernel development. Everything there happens today in the Linux kernel, and the goal of that team, and that team is growing, and there's a lot of vendors engaged in it as well. They just work as part of the Linux kernel to make sure that Xen works, and it does, out of the box. Then, and that's kind of showing you also a little bit how that whole sub-project model works. So we have in about 2007, Samsung took the Xen code base and forked it and ported it to the ARM CPUs. And because they forked it and it became a really big set of code, it never really made it, upstream. It never really became part of the Xen hypervisor. And we had a few attempts to kind of make this happen, but typically, when you have huge code bases and try to change them and get them upstream, that takes many, many years. So in 2011, ARM published a new instruction set, or a new instruction set extension which allowed you to virtualize the hypervisors directly on their architecture in a very easy and clean way. So when it happened, rather than trying to take that existing code base and try and upstream it, we decided within the community to start again and take all the stuff we learned from the original Samsung port and learn from it and move forward. So we created the Xen on ARM project. And the goal of that project was fundamentally to build ARM support into the hypervisor baseline, right? And because that's the goal, at some point that means that sub-project will end because the goal will have been achieved. So we're quite close to that. So Xen 4.3 had ARM support, 4.4 had ARM support, 4.5, has a few missing bits. And then at some point, we'll just merge those two back into the main project. And that gives you a sort of an idea of this concept of sub-projects within the Xen project, right? So we can have sub-projects for a specific goal, or sub-projects which develop new technologies which sit on top of Xen. So let's look at another one, right? So there's another sub-project within the Xen project called the XAPI tool stack. And that is a control tool stack which is built on top of Xen, and it's used in Xen Server, and it's used by a few people in that room as well. Of course, we also had this thing called XCP, or Xen Cloud Platform, which is basically Xen plus XAPI taken together, and a couple of build scripts. And at the end of the day, we had an ISO which is delivered, to the users. Now, XCP always was just a clone variant of Xen Server. So when Xen Server became open source, basically what we decided, we had a community vote earlier this year. It was this year, wasn't it? Yeah. To basically say, well, it's confusing if people have to go to Xen Project for XCP, if they can also go to Xen Server. So we had a vote on both sides, and we basically decided to take XCP and move it to Xen Server because it's open source and it's a more natural fit. Then, there's a lot of other upstream projects we work with and where our community contributes to. And we contribute to BSD. So there's Xen support for DOM 0 and FreeBSD. We work with projects like Grub, QEMU, and many others. There's new ones, where Galois, for example, Adam is from Galois, is going to upstream Xen support for FreeRTOS. And there's a lot more of these kind of projects which we depend on and work with. We also, Russell alluded to unikernels or library operating systems. So one of them, Mirage OS, is a sub-project of the Xen project. It came into the incubator at the beginning of last year, and at some point, probably later this year or early next year, it'll incubate because we will have a vibrant community of vendors and contributors built around it. So one of the ideas, behind those sub-projects is, it could be a project, a larger project which achieves a single aim, such as adding ARM support or adding a big piece of functionality to the hypervisor. And to make it easier for people, we create these sub-projects to give you a focal point to coalesce around. Or it could be developing a new code base, and then we require that project becomes mature. And the way how it becomes mature is that it demonstrates it has a user base and a contributor base which is diverse around it, which is very much how Apache works as well. So, then it becomes interesting. We also work, then we actually have a lot of upstreams we work with, like libvirt, CentOS, but the list is endless. We also work with Ubuntu, with other library OSs. The list is endless. Cloud orchestration stacks. Then it becomes interesting because we're moving away from the sort of core Xen hypervisor use cases. Now, originally, Xen was developed for the data center and for the cloud. And what's happening now, I really should have looked at my slides before I gave the presentation. Okay, step back. We also just created a sub-project which develops and maintains the Windows PV drivers. So the background there is a a project outside of the Xen community which has developed a set of Windows PV drivers called GPL-PV. And the guy who originally developed that, he keeps on developing it, but there's some issues of getting these drivers signed because they're GPL, particularly with Windows 8 and 8.1. However, Xen Server, of course, also has a set of PV drivers, and then Amazon has developed their own set of PV drivers. Oracle has developed their own set of PV drivers for Windows. So it kind of felt a little bit stupid to just try and replicate that. And so what we've done is created a sub-project which develops these drivers, and we just kicked that off. And we're having companies like Oracle, Citrix, Amazon, and others collaborating around these. And they're in a BSD license, and the aim is to just develop them and then make it easy to use the Windows update mechanism for these drivers so that we pushed up into Windows. Okay, so back to the interesting and unusual part I was alluding to twice beforehand, and then I got thrown over by not actually thinking this through. So, in fact, what became really interesting is that when we started this ARM work, we suddenly had a big influx of embedded vendors who thought, oh God, this stuff is really cool. This solves a few real problems for us. Where you have a type 1 hypervisor for isolation and then a few small number of VMs, typically 3 or 4 for specific use cases. And to help that community get off the ground, we created a embedded and automotive sub-project. And they're working on getting Xen into cars, into internet television, into all sorts of different use cases. Something I didn't expect at all. And to do that, at the bottom, they're working with proprietary operating systems such as QNX, and with operating systems which are open source such as Android and Tizen. We actually have a PV port for Xen, for Android and QNX already. So, and then there's a lot more of that. So I kind of wanted to take what I just said and put it into a use case view. So here at the bottom we have the foundation, right? The hypervisor, some foundation technologies for server as well as embedded. And then the way how I see it, we really have 3 main columns on top of that. So one's the sort of traditional cloud and server virtualization use cases. And that's what you probably all know. Then actually, there's a number of security-based products built on top of Xen called Cubes OS, and then there's another one called OpenXT, which used to be Citrix Xen Center RT, I think. And it's become an open source project where the NSA and others collaborate around. And now we have this embedded sub-project. And then, but even in the server space, what's happening right now is that we're moving away from server virtualization in general. So we're moving to sort of data-defined everything. So what we're seeing, is network function virtualization and storage and other areas emerging as separate blocks on top of that. So you might think, and then we have library operating systems such as OSV and Mirage and Erlang and Xen and so on, which kind of useful for all of these use cases. So they don't necessarily can be confined to one. So an example recently is Erlang on Xen. They built a Open vSwitch appliance on top of Erlang on Xen, which kind of service that network function virtualization box, really. So one thing you might ask is, all this activity outside of the core use cases, isn't that distracting the community? Isn't that bad for all the server guys, right? For all the cloud guys? And actually, the answer is No. In fact, it isn't, because that was one of my worries, that suddenly I would have the community being pulled in lots of different directions and get fragmentation. But actually what's happening is that there's a lot of synergies and, oops. Why is that? That there are actually a lot of synergies and opportunities between those different segments. And I just wanted to show you some examples. Right? So we have the same picture we had before. So let's look at one of the areas which is important for embedded. So the specific use case there is using Xen as a hypervisor in drones, which might be a very strange use case, right? And certification is important there. Well, why is this good for the other segments? Well, certification means somebody will take a lot of time going through your code, validate it, certify it, find bugs, and all those changes go back into the main code base. So that's really good from a robustness, quality, and security perspective across the board, right? Let's look at some other examples. So in automotive, real-time scheduling is very important because you need to, you need to make sure that your VM in a car fulfills certain SLAs. And of course, also in these sort of more consumer-oriented segments, peripheral support is very important as well. So we have companies currently developing PV drivers for graphics, for touch screens, for all sorts of I/O devices which are important in the consumer space. So again, that's kind of good for the cloud and server virtualization space again, because it enables things such as TV and gaming use cases in the cloud. And where those exist, it will make those better. Because, for example, if I have a real-time scheduler, I can guarantee, that my graphics decoding VM gets enough time to be always effective. It's also really interesting if you're developing a cloud with very strict service SLAs. So an example there is Verizon Cloud. So what Verizon does, and I showed that at the Developer Summit, is they have very strict SLAs. So as a user of their cloud, I can say, I want exactly that much bandwidth, that much CPU power, and so on and so forth, and that's all you get. You won't get any less, and you won't get any more. And the way how they implemented this all in hardware. And by doing so, they have a lot of unused resources. So for example, what they do is to guarantee the CPU SLA, they take one virtual CPU and run it on one real CPU, and then the rest of that CPU isn't used ultimately. And then they map it to specific machines with specific horsepower. That seems very ineffective. So if we could do this in software with real-time scheduling, obviously that's very good. But that's not without challenges, right? If we get all these different camps within a community, then we end up with some challenges. And those are the ones which come down to users, where we need to make sure that the software is well integrated, it's usable. And for that reason, the primary goal for these new sub-projects we're creating is to make them upstream stuff straight from the beginning and make it usable straight out of the box. Because we have been in that situation once before, right? You saw that security box with all those security solutions, and they're all there, but they're not as nicely integrated as they could have been if we had done stuff straight from the beginning. So why the Xen project? Very brief overview. Why is the project important? And I'm running late already, but hey. So for me, it comes down to four things, right? We're proven within the largest hyperscale clouds. It's not just Amazon. There's a number of other big vendors who use Xen, and there's new ones who decide to use Xen. And that means something, right? It's also, from the ground up, designed for security, and you'll hear a little bit more about that later. I think there's 2 or 3 talks related to security, so we'll get to that then, and I think you'll see how this works in practice. There's a lot of innovation going on in the community right now. I'm just picking out, a few, right? So there's GPU virtualization. So Intel developed a graphics stack for their hardware extension called Xen GT, and they're upstreaming the enablers to that into the Xen project right now. That will enable you to use their graphics hardware and have different ways of using graphics virtualization, and it's basically designed for the cloud. We have lots of cloud operating systems, or library OSs or unikernels, however you want to call them, and we'll hear a bit about that as well. And of course, ARM support is quite interesting too, because of the fact that it's enabled that whole embedded segment. But it's possibly also interesting for servers. And what I find really cool about it is that it's small and lean, right? If you look at the ARM hypervisor, the ARM Xen Project hypervisor, that's only about 18,000 lines of code. That's practically nothing, right? And gives you pretty much all the same functionality today as the same we have on x86. And the platform, is extremely versatile. And that's why we see all these different use cases cropping up. So, how does it work? I'll go through this. Who knows how the project works? One person. Okay. All right, so I won't really see. So, fundamentally, we have this thing called project governance. And as many open source projects, or particularly the Linux kernel, we actually didn't have any real governance at all until 2011. We only had unwritten rules, which was a little bit of a problem for community members at the time. So we sat together and basically decided, let's write down how we work, right? So there's a few core elements to it. So there's a number of principles we work to. They're our values, and they're like openness, transparency, and meritocracy. Whenever we do something, we do it in the... Openness means anyone can join the community. We won't push anyone back. Transparency means everything we do is public. And meritocracy is you get influenced by doing stuff. Then we have a number of roles. And they're getting more. The number of roles is growing as we expand. So we have project leads. We have release managers. So Conrad, for example, from Oracle is here. He's going to talk about Xen 4.5. He's managing the 4.5 release. We have committers. These are people who have write access to the repositories. We have maintainers. Those are the people who review, who have to say that when somebody submits a patch to a specific piece of code, they need to say that it's okay and that it can go in because it's of good enough quality. And then we have spokespeople, volunteers in the community who go and talk to the press. Or write articles and so on and so forth on blog posts for the press and so on. How do we make decisions? So we follow a model called lazy consensus, which is basically the default is that somebody makes a proposal, and if there's no dissent, it gets that's it. If there is disagreement, then we have to work through the disagreements, and then at some point, the project lead just gets to put his foot down or her foot down and solves any indecision we had. But surprisingly, we actually hardly ever need to make use of that. Then we have this thing called project life cycle, and that determines how our sub-projects are run. And then we have a lot of different community initiatives and best practices. And these are things like document days, I'll talk about this later, test days. We have a thing called a publicity list. the security team, how do we do code reviews, all those kind of practical things. And they get established in a way how we described earlier. They're almost the outcomes of this whole process. On the other hand, we have corporate governance, right? So this was the community aspect. So when we moved to the Linux Foundation a year ago, we moved to a model where companies with a stake in the community could actually help the community with funds, right? So we built up, we created this advisory board. Each member company in the advisory board pays an annual fee, and that money is then used for the best of the community. For example, advisory board funds were used to organize this event, right? But there's a lot more that the advisory board does. And here's a list of companies which basically are on the advisory board and fund the project, besides all the other community work. I'm not going to go through those, but you can see there's a lot of really big names on there. And on average, I'm signing up a new company every 3 months. So we actually have been growing by 4 companies since we started in last year. So what does the advisory board do? Well, we do things like how do we talk about the project? We do PR. We're going to have an analyst meeting for the first time, sometimes in Q3. And a goal area really is to talk about the project and promote it. And that's really important in today's open source world. Because if you don't get talked about, people assume you don't exist. And if you look at projects like Docker, right, who do this really well, you can see what impact that can have. We also deal with boring things such as membership rules and legal and trademarks. I'm not going to say any more about that. This is where it becomes interesting. We actually provide funds to solve common good problems within the community, such as, at the moment, such as testing, quality, security, and train up new developers. So, 2 of the biggest problems in the community, well, actually one of the biggest problems we had last year was that the project didn't have an independent test infrastructure. Each vendor in a community would go and do their own testing. So we decided, let's pool together and build up an independently hosted test infrastructure. And I just got, basically everything's approved. We're just going into execution mode now. And hopefully by the end of the year, the project will have initially 26 machines, which are hosted in a colo somewhere, and will be running our tests independently. Another area which has been problematic for a lot of the vendors on the board is that they're all trying to expand, but there's not enough developers in the community. This is actually a general problem in open source today. Open source has been so successful that it's very hard to find developers with the right skills. So we're working, with open source programs such as Google Summer of Code, OPW, and others to build new developers. And the board acts as a referee of last resort if there was ever any total stalemate in the community. Okay, so how do the 2 parts come together? Well, companies and communities tend to not always work very well together, right? Because they have different goals. So we built these things called working groups, where we have members of the community as well as members from the companies to work together. So we have a working group for testing. We have one for PR. We also have a thing called the technical coordination team. So Russell, how much extra time are you going to give me? Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So I wanted to briefly ask the question, what was the impact of moving the project to the Linux Foundation? And sorry about that picture of a London skyscraper here. I couldn't find one which I could use from New York without paying for it. So I kind of decided to just use that one. Well, the developer community was largely unaffected by that move to the Linux Foundation, and that was by design, right? Except for things like growth, which has come from it, which you'll see when we look at stats a little bit later. We had an extra layer of governance, and we talked about that already. But what's really interesting is that move to the Linux Foundation and that creation of the advisory board, which incidentally I chair, which is why I've been talking about we all the time and not them, is that it actually helped get all these companies who only loosely collaborated beforehand working a lot more closely together. And that's actually really good for the project, and we'll see this when Conrad does his 4.5 release update, because at the end of the day, that meant we have one of the most feature-richest releases coming up ever. And I think we'll see more of that in the future because of that. Another thing is that actually, we have a lot more engagement with our user base than we had a year ago. Now, if you look at the history of Xen, fundamentally the issue we had is it was always a very developer-focused community, and the developers sort of said, we don't really care about users, just keep them away, right? And the Linux Foundation doesn't really have quite that attitude, and our members on the board don't have this attitude either, and we've been trying to fix this, but it just takes time, right? And we're engaging users more, and you'll find out a little bit more how you might benefit from that too. So, looking back, so there's going to be a lot of boring stats now, and I'll do these very quickly. So, if you look at this shows you the number of press mentions Xen and the Xen project got over time, right? What's really interesting is that before we joined the Linux Foundation, we would get maybe 10, 15 press mentions a month, and this was spanning back for years, right? And that's why a lot of people thought Xen is dead or Xen is Citrix, because there were more press mentions about Xen and Citrix than about Xen and open source. And we've been building on that, and if you look at that, that's really a lot of growth. We had 1,200 press mentions in Q2 of this year alone. That's quite significant, and it was actually quite similar to what Docker got in that month as well, and quite a lot more than KVM got, and it's quite similar also what VMware gets with their hypervisor. So that's kind of good, and we're trying to stabilize around that level to create a level playing field. And that's been directly driven, by the advisory board. If you look at website and social media traffic, so our website traffic on average has been growing by 30% a month, and social media has been growing by 47%. That's quite a big improvement as well. Now, this shows you the, actually it's only really the graph at the bottom which is interesting. This shows you the number of developers which are active at any given month in the project. And you can see that that's been growing to about, on an average of 80 developers a month. And that's basically code submissions by 80 people, every single month. This just shows you the same just for the hypervisor. And again, you can see that growth there. And in fact, we're at the point now where it is starting to get painful. So we need, and where we don't have enough code reviewers. So in the hypervisor project, for example, we're at this point now where we see a slowdown because the community is growing too fast and we have to build new reviewers before we can get new code in. Good problem to have, so. We improved quality, right? So when we became, when we joined the Linux Foundation, there's this tool called Coverity Scan, which you can sign up to as an independent open source project. And that scans your code base for possible security issues and bugs. And it also measures your quality by a metric called issue density. So we reduced this from just above 1 to 0.66. And we fixed about 914 issues and dismissed 314 as false positives. And this was all done by community members. And there's a relatively small number of issues still open, but they will keep on getting fixed. If you compare that to Linux, Linux last year had 0.73 and reduced it to 0.61, and KVM, the last public measure was 1.54. I don't know what it is now. They haven't published it. And I can't see KVM figures. But we improved quality, which is great, and there's going to be more of this. Because that's one of the things all of our members really care about. Or care about a lot. For big cloud providers like Amazon, they don't want to have to deal with any quality issues when they upgrade Xen. If Oracle and Citrix releases a new product, same thing. We have developed more tests, and we're building a new test infrastructure. So there will be a lot more of that too. We have sub-projects. I touched on them already, so I'm going to skip this now. But generally, that whole model of the sub-project's been actually very good for the project overall. It's a way to expand into new areas without distracting, from the core functionality of the project. We've been training up new students and interns as part of Google Summer of Code and GNOME Outreach Program for Women. We had 7 participants this year. Most of them were really, really good, and we've done this in the past. And some of our most active developers, and typically a third of those people stay around and stay part of the community. And some of our maintainers now came in originally through this route. One thing which is really interesting is, and it's something where the Xen project seems to be odd, is we seem to attract a lot of women, unlike other projects, which is also a great thing because we're leading change there. The 4.5 release, you'll hear about that from Conrad, is shaping up to be the most feature-rich release ever. So, practical tips on how you can benefit. I'll do that quickly. So, this shows you what you could do and what's in it for you. Well, we have document, and then there'll be a link to where you can find out stuff. Document days. Well, once a month we run document days where we improve documentation, and it has a to-do list. And if you have an issue, just add something to the to-do list. Of course, you could participate more if you wanted to, but the benefit for you is better documentation. We have test days built into the release cycle, where release candidates are tested. So, you really, if you use Xen, just test the bits you want, and then when a release comes out, or which you depend on, and then when a release comes out, fundamentally, that it'll work, the release works for you. Distros and Linux, of course, have a dependency on Xen, or vice versa. So when they make a release and you use them, you may want to use your version of Xen within their test days or whatever those communities do. And we also have a thing called the ecosystem directory. And that's basically a directory where you can advertise what you do, and that gives you advertisements at, visibility. Here we go. If you find a bug, report it. So this shows you what a good bug report looks like. I'm not going to go through this. If you want to know more, follow that link. The slides will all be available afterwards. But then there's the other really interesting thing. The project can actually help you gain visibility. And I'll use an example here from the Xen Orchestra guys, right? So was it 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, right? Olivia approached me with an idea about an article about Xen Orchestra and Docker integration, something they're working on right now. So we actually have a PR person working for the project. So those guys and community members helped review the article, made suggestions, can we also publish it on linux.com and other articles, and other areas? So we did. So that blog, instead of just going out on a Xen Orchestra blog, it also went out on a Xen Project blog and on linux.com. And then it got picked up, by the register, right? And that's a lot more impact than it would have been as if it just had been on a Xen Orchestra blog. And the outcome really is positive PR for the project, but it's also a lot of positive coverage for you as a community member. And if you have a small project or something, it helps you build your user base. And the process for that is very easy. You just send an email or an idea to publicity@xenproject.org, and then we take it from there. And that's it. If you have questions, fire off. Sorry for running late. I'm starting to become Ian Pratt, who always needed half an hour more than he was allocated. Any questions?